Tim Lenderking, Special Envoy for Yemen. Thank you so much for joining CNBC.
My pleasure.
Before we get to the topic at hand, I've got to ask you about a story, a rumor, potentially, that President Xi Jinping will make a visit to Saudi Arabia. How does that make you feel? Because at the end of the day, you were on that historic visit of the U.S. president this summer to Saudi Arabia, a visit, I might add, that was largely panned on both sides of the aisle as having accomplished not that much. Do you feel this is troubling? Do you feel it's challenging? What does it say that after the visit of the U.S. president, Xi Jinping has decided that Saudi Arabia might be his first stop?
The first thing I would take issue with is the notion that I have seen that some people say that the visit didn't accomplish anything. I think it clearly did, and having been part of the discussions and seeing the array of topics that were covered, everything from economics and trade and investment and counterterrorism, regional conflicts, rattle all the major regional conflicts off: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and of course Yemen, all played a part, which to me shows the depth of the U.S.-Saudi relationship and why this relationship needs to be important to both countries. So I think that's the first thing. I think the president did accomplish a lot on that trip, and I think restoring the relationship was very important. As to the Chinese visit, I deal, of course, with the Chinese on Yemen. On Yemen, they are a helpful player, and one of the benefits that we have on Yemen is P5 unity, so unity among the P5 countries when it comes to commitment to no military solution to the conflict, that there has to be a negotiated solution, that the humanitarian crisis must be dealt with. And in that sense, I'm very glad for the role that the Chinese have played on Yemen and the consultations that I have with them.
But in terms of a visit by the Chinese president to Saudi Arabia, do you find that disturbing?
I mean, I think
as a U.S. official who understands this region probably better than most.
Saudi Arabia and China and the other countries of this region have diplomatic relations, so we would expect that there would be visits. The question is, what's the content? And look, I think the major message that the president brought to the region is the United States is not going anywhere. The United States is a vital partner to not only Saudi Arabia, but each of the countries in the region. And having the GCC plus 3 countries, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq, present in Jeddah, I think was a major statement. And the fact that, again, from my bailiwick, that we saw Yemen playing an important part in the discussions there only indicates the regional consensus that the United States has been able to drive on Yemen to end this conflict now.
Okay, walk me through that, because, looking at it from the hat of a market watch, everybody in the market was looking for something to happen on oil. That didn't necessarily happen that week. Perhaps there are discussions that over the long term we'll see the fruition, but that was not happening in terms of we're going to put more oil on the table right now because you're our ally and we owe it to you and you support us with weapons and et cetera, et cetera. That did not happen. And so many people criticized that on both sides of the aisle. And also the idea that so much of the conversation, at least on the press side, revolved around Jamal Khashoggi. So tell me what actually was accomplished with regards to your file.
Well, as I mentioned, Yemen was one of many topics. So energy was discussed, the situation in Iraq and Syria, as I noted, cyber security, really important things that I think countries that have a 70 or 80-year-old relationship would have things to say in common about, and common approaches. So I was very, inspired, I think, by that level of discussion. On Yemen specifically, of course, that visit by the president took place just 2 weeks before the UN truce was set to expire. It was extended on August 2nd, in no small part because of the conversations that the president and the Saudi Crown Prince had about Yemen, which was to agree that there needs to be an expanded and extended truce, and thus I'm already back in the region to work on these very challenges. So I think the fact that we set in motion the pieces that needed to happen for the truce to be extended, we're now looking at 6 months, Hadley, 6 months of unbroken peace. There have been skirmishes, no question about that, but this is the best opportunity that Yemen has had for peace in 6 years. And so I think that's a significant difference and shows the kind of cooperation that we're seeing with countries in the region and indeed with parties in Yemen to really try to end this conflict.
How do you negotiate with these people at the end of the day? Because nobody in this region wants rockets coming to Riyadh, rockets coming to the UAE, hitting oil infrastructure, hitting really the beating heart of the economies here.
And then that's a very important factor. I think when you look at Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia and Vision 2040 and the other visions that each of the Gulf countries has, all of them get undermined by a hot war in Yemen, which is drawing resources, which is drawing negative attention to the region, which is creating space for Al-Qaeda or ISIS to increase their presence, which is bringing Yemen's economy down and making it more difficult for that country to get off its feet and get away from the kind of foreign assistance that it is reliant on. So I think all of the countries in the region are finding that the Yemen conflict, it's not part of the economic vision that anybody has. And I think
this needs to be put to bed, if you will.
It needs to be put to bed, right? Not just put on low, the back burner or low boil. It needs to be put to bed. And I think if you look at Qatar and Kuwait and certainly Oman, which has played such an important role in extending the last truce, but in general in endorsing the idea of a political resolution of this conflict, all of these countries are negatively affected by a hot war in Yemen, by displacement, by refugee flows, again, by the increase in terrorism that results when there's ungoverned spaces. And I think people are upset also by the humanitarian situation, the fact that Yemenis are suffering and have been for 7 years. It's why we're putting so much money on the table to back the humanitarian efforts here. $1 billion this year alone, bringing us up to $5 billion since the conflict started. We're one of the largest donors to the Yemen humanitarian situation, but there needs to be more, in fact. And I'll be talking with the countries of the region as I make my way through the Gulf about these issues.
What's your gauge of success here? How close are we to resolving this situation?
I think we've made significant progress, and I give
if you were putting like a number or a percentage on this.
Well, I think that we're better than 50%. Yeah. I wouldn't have said that 6 months ago. I think the fact that there is a truce, it's been extended twice, and that you have serious engagement from the parties who have been, fighting with each other. There have been some important, albeit technical, meetings that have taken place between military elements from the different sides. These have been incredibly constructive meetings, and you've got to have that kind of personal engagement, I think, to really start to build confidence among the rank and file and amongst the leaders to turn the corner here. So I look at that. I look at the fact that the parties have made some difficult steps to support the truce. But we're at a point where come October 2nd, when this truce expires, we need to have more elements of the truce on the table, not just flights, commercial flights from Sana'a to Amman, Jordan, but to other destinations around the Gulf. We've got to see movement on salary payments. Yemen civil servants haven't been paid for years.
Yeah.
So we've got to address that issue. Taiz Road, Yemen's third largest city. It's besieged by Houthis who've got to find ways to agree to open some of the access roads and relieve the humanitarian situation there. That is also a priority. And conversations are happening now to address these problems. They've got to go forward. They've got to surge forward with strong international support to help the parties, make the right decisions.
Nothing happens in this part of the world in a vacuum. So a
Indeed.
problem that's happening with Yemen, as we say, does include the Chinese element. You were in those conversations with the president and the Saudis in Jeddah just a month or so ago. When we think about what happens next, obviously the largest foreign direct investor in Saudi Arabia and UAE is China. And the prospect of a visit from the Chinese president to this part of the world is in many ways a huge coup for oil-producing countries. It just says emphasizes yet again the importance of energy when it comes to geopolitics. As a diplomat, when you take a step back and think about this, where is the opportunity for the United States to use those growing relationships between Beijing and all these Gulf Arab countries, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE and others, to our benefit as Americans? In the sense that, can they be a conduit, not just for messaging, but for pressure as well? Because when they look at their energy dynamic, half of their oil comes from this part of the world. And to my knowledge, our taxpayers are still putting the Fifth Fleet here. We've got an air base in Qatar. We're still supporting this part of the world and their energy flows with taxpayer money.
That's right, and I think that is continuing, even though the president has made it clear that he wants to, move the American footprint in a different direction. But I think again,
that doesn't include military changes, does it?
I hope not. I mean, I think that you're looking at the president coming here in July, big step, not only to Saudi Arabia but gathering the GCC countries plus 3 regional powers. And his message was America's not going anywhere. America can be counted on to remain in the neighborhood and as a support for the countries and their security. That is an American priority.
Right. And
by the way, that's fundamental to my mission as the U.S. envoy to Yemen, to know that the regional countries can feel secure if they are attacked. And look, I hope we're at a point where there will be no more attacks either into Saudi Arabia or the Gulf countries or into Yemen from the outside. This is a moment through the truce where that element has been de-escalated. And if we do our work right on October 2nd, then we move to not only extend the truce, but we expand it. So, and here again, I think the adversarial relationships that great powers may have at a certain level are not necessarily playing out in the Yemen conflict, and I really feel that that's important to preserve. Yeah. The Chinese are the president of the Security Council this month, and I know that they want to see progress in Yemen during their presidency on the Security Council, and I think that's an important element where we can find commonality between us, China, Russia, the United States, working together on a political solution to the Yemen conflict.
But can you look at Saudi Arabia and look at the UAE and say, hey, listen, we're going to continue to support you militarily to any threat that you may see. We're going to continue to essentially protect your oil supplies that are going to Asian markets, because that's what we're doing. And at the same point, we want something from you. We want you to talk to Beijing. We want you to pressure Beijing. Is that a possibility in your mind?
I mean, that's diplomacy, I think, in essence. But bear in mind that the U.S. military presence here isn't just about oil and energy. We've got American citizens living in this city and in Dubai and in many parts of Saudi Arabia. We've got a large American community. And it's the president's major priority to see that Americans are protected. So there is an element of deterrence that we're trying to establish. The president has also made clear that the United States is not going to sell anything or everything that any of these countries want. There are limits. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it's that we will not sell offensive weapons that could be used in Yemen. We're finding that there is enough in the president's message on security that it gives, I think, the Saudis, from what I've seen, enough confidence that they can take some bold steps on Yemen. And I think we're seeing them do that. We need to see the Houthis do that as well.
Yeah. So you think, post those visits and the visit of the president to Saudi Arabia specifically, you think that there's a new tone, perhaps, in the relationship that shows the GCC, shows Saudi Arabia that they can be secure in the knowledge that America still has their back?
I do, and I think that came through very clearly in the meetings and in the interactions that the president had with the various Gulf and Saudi leaders in Jeddah just a few weeks ago. I think that was very positive.
The huge sort of elephant in the room on any conversation about the Gulf is always going to be Iran. And obviously the Saudis and the UAE and other Gulf Arab countries have been talking to them over the last couple of years, which was actually a significant development that we've seen. Right now, the JCPOA, those conversations are continuing. Given the gas situation, the oil situation, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all of these elements circulating, it feels as if the West is willing to do anything to get a deal, to get Iranian crude back on the table, to get it back on the market, to help alleviate some of this supply crunch. How dangerous is that view, do you think, at this point?
My main concern with Iran, of course, is its behavior in Yemen, where I see that Iran fuels...
Which isn't addressed at all in a JCPOA conversation.
There
is no second track,
That's
right?
right. That's right. So this has to be dealt with in other ways, right? So you have
But doesn't that seem slightly...
a Saudi-Iran track, which I think
off to you? That we're not having that conversation in tandem? How can you say one and still claim to have leverage?
Look, we may get there if there's progress through the JCPOA and it opens up dialogue between the United States and Iran. That's great. That will help. That will help. But I don't have the luxury of waiting for that. We need peace in Yemen now. The parties have made some important steps. We can't afford to slide backwards. I was pleased that Iran welcomed the truce on April 2nd, on June 2nd, on August 2nd. We need to see that positive rhetoric matched by deeds in Yemen. So not smuggling weapons into the Houthis, not providing lethal aid, not green-lighting attacks in the region. We need to move away from that. And Yemen's at a point where it's starting to be able to stand up and saying, that's not the way we want to go. And that's what we're trying to capitalize on and build.
Yeah. The worry, though, of course, is that a JCPOA, if that is accomplished, that, of course, unlocks a heck of a lot of money to Iran. They're back in the world financial system. They're also obviously able to sell their crude at market prices. They don't have to hide it and send it to China on ghost ships. That means there's going to be a lot more money to throw around. And that could potentially upend what you're trying to do, other situations in this part of the world, particularly when it comes to Lebanon, Hezbollah, etc. What is the better of two options at this point? Is it better to get an agreement on JCPOA, which may or may not preclude them from eventually moving toward a nuclear weapon? Or is it better to allow them to continue to play their game in Vienna, come to no real resolution, and get at least one part of this puzzle solved? I mean, it seems as if you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, how do you describe that as a diplomat?
Well, I describe it as what I would like to see is Iran play a better and more constructive role in Yemen.
Yeah.
That could happen whether there's a deal or not, in my view.
So it is not essential to get there in order for Yemen to be solved?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And I think many of the people I deal with, I do not have direct contact with the Iranians, but many of the people that I work with on this file are speaking to them regularly.
Yeah.
And I know that they can pass messages. They do pass messages. Some of the countries that I deal with have good relations with Iran. And frankly, I think that's useful when we're dealing with a tricky and very complex file like Yemen, is that in which Iran plays a role. Somebody's got to be talking to the Iranians about what we all need to see to fix the Yemen situation.
Right.
So I consider those channels very important.
Yeah. And in terms of a JCPOA, I mean, you've been out here a long time. You have a lot of experience with the Saudis in particular. A few years ago, I had a conversation with Khalid al-Fallah, the then energy minister, about the possibility of a nuclear Saudi Arabia. And he didn't smack that down. It became very clear through conversations with him and Mohammed bin Salman that if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, then Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab countries would probably feel pressured to do the same. In your mind, how dangerous is it, the possibility that we could see a nuclear Middle East? Because just because we sign a JCPOA, if you look at the history, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Iranians are going to be truthful about what they're actually planning to accomplish in the long run. And I guess further to that, does the administration understand that?
Well, I think we're all worried about more confrontation that could happen between Iran, the Gulf countries, the U.S., and obviously the JCPOA is intended to de-escalate some of that.
Yeah.
Again, from the Yemen piece, what I want to see is some world attention focused on Yemen. The fact that there's positive movement needs to be encouraged, needs to be supported in a multitude of ways. There's also, in relation to this, there's a tanker full of 1.1 million barrels of oil off the coast of Yemen that could erupt, explode, start leaking, the Safar tanker. We're supporting a UN effort right now to get that oil. That ship has been unmaintained for 7 years. It is a dead ship.
Yeah.
There are no functioning parts.
Yeah.
That oil needs to be taken care of before something really bad happens, before there's an environmental catastrophe. So we're working with the UN, get enough pledges, and we're very, very close and would like to see more support from the region and from the private sector to meet the target of 80 million so we can offload that oil onto a more secure vessel. Get that done this year and get this environmental time bomb off the table. This is another one of the issues why I think the world's economies need to be looking, the regional economies need to be looking at this. The Safar tanker blows, then you've got fishing problems, you've got transit problems through a vital waterway. You've got destruction of coastal habitat.
Yeah.
And you've exacerbated the Yemen humanitarian situation by a problem that is preventable if we take the steps now. So just by way of illustrating what's at stake here when we talk about Yemen, why we need some international focus, and to use it to encourage the positive trajectory that I think the conflict is trying to get on.
Do you believe that we will see nuclear weapons in this part of the world? And I'm talking about Iran and potentially the Gulf Arab countries.
I mean, I think that would be unfortunate. I hope that's not the case.
But it's possible.
I suppose. My concern, of course, is what do we do about Yemen?
Yeah.
Well, there's so much attention elsewhere.
Yeah.
We've got a moment to change the nature of the conflict and really to turn the corner and bring more benefit, I think, from the truce and related elements to the Yemenis. This is the time to do it.
Yeah.
This is the opportunity to make that happen.
And so just in the JCPOA track, I mean, we talk about these things being separate, potentially separate, but equal, I guess, in terms of their importance. You know, putting Iranian crude, allowing Iranian crude back on the market, does that bode well for the Yemen truce or not? Because if they got, as I say, extra money to mess around with, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be willing to put some of these things to bed. Does that make your job more or less difficult if Iran puts its crude back on the market?
What we need is the Iranian leadership to make a political decision to support peace in Yemen. And I'd like to see that decision made. That's going to help address this regional problem, which I think all the countries of the region do want to see dealt with. Again, to have Yemen on fire and to have it fall back into the kind of conflict, the hot war that it was before, is really in nobody's interest, not even in Iran's interest either. So that's why seizing the moment and why I'm back out here to work on this.
Tim, it's great to have you.
Thank you
so
very
much
much
for joining CNBC.
My pleasure.
Very good. Thank you.